What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity. It is time to nerd out with your geek out, and today on the podcast, you're going to get to hear from the one and only Stephen Knapp. That is right. You probably know Stephen Knapp if you're a podcast fan, because he is Padres, friends, and collaborator with Philip Clayton. They've written a number of articles and books together, including Predicament of Belief. But today on the podcast, you're going to get to hear the story, the biography of an academic who fell in love with the Romantics, who then had an experience that led him back into the life of the church and faith. You're going to get to hear from someone whose academic discipline that started their critical thinking is a literary criticism, his engagement with postmodernism and that whole process, his connection and friendship with Phil, and then their lifelong journey into critical and faithful reflection about the Christian faith. And then you're going to get to hear from someone who just finished serving 10 years as president of George Mason University in Washington, D.C. He's going to tell us about millennials, higher education, give some advice for people thinking, reflecting on going to school, talking about if you have thinking about having children or have children and their education and that kind of thing. It's really a blast. I'm just excited to share it with you. Before we jump into the podcast, I want to tell you a few things. Number one, I want to say welcome to Aaron and Jillian, brand new members of Homebrewed Christianity community. That's right. Jillian and Aaron just joined the Homebrewed community, and you can too. How convenient. I know. It's convenient. You go to homebrewedcommunity.com and you can get yourself an ecclesiastical title. I know it's what all the cool kids said. They're like, Trip, we would like to be a deacon or a bishop or something like that. And I said, look, I will make you one. I will, with the power I gain from absolutely nowhere except the internet. And make you one when you join the community. You'll be a part of the secret Facebook group. You'll get access to all sorts of extra classes, downloads, and special events and encounters. You'll also get access to the cheapest tickets to all the Homebrewed events. And very soon, we're going to be announcing 2018 Theology Beer Camp locations. Oh, yeah, that's right. And I got to tell you, I was surprised about some of the cities that multiple people said, bring it to our town. So we're working on that right now. And if you were one of those people, you probably got an email recently and you should return it, saying like, are you really down to rock and roll? And by that, we mean nerd out with your geek out for multiple days, enjoying your local craft beverages, getting nerdy. So, yeah. If you're listening to this, contemporaneously, like the week it comes out, on October 30th in Raleigh, North Cackalack, at Christ the King Lutheran Church, we're having a Reformation birthday party. The Protestant Reformation is turning 500, and we're doing a live podcast. You should come. You should be there, unless that's already happened. Then you can listen to it on the podcast. Also, later in November, we're going to be doing a screening of The Story of Us, the new Morgan Freeman show, in Charlotte at Myers Park Baptist Church. And there's another live podcast about to be announced, probably in the next week or so, happening in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, because, well, I'm back in North Carolina. So then I'm going to do stuff around here. That also means if you are on the East Coast, and especially within driving distance, and you want to host a live podcast or a Theology Nerd boot camp or something, holler at Trip. Email him, trip@homebrewedchristianity.com. I've already gotten some emails from friends back in the ATL. They said, Trip, can you nerd out with your geek out down here? I said, yes, I can. And so, if you're an East Coaster and you want to put together something, holler at me, because if it's in driving distance, it's just a lot easier to do. But anyway, I also have a lot more time. I'm putting into Homebrewed Christianity. So if you just want me to come talk and speak or anything like that, you can holler, anywhere that I can get to. I don't do Antarctica. Nope. I don't. Last, before we jump in, I got my recommendation for this week. And I was last a couple times, I keep getting feedback. I did like 3 the first time. Then last time I did 5 different Keith Ward books because Keith Ward was on. And I know people are like, that was great. But today it's only 1 recommendation, but it's kind of like 20. Your friend, I'm sure he is, because he's one of the nicest people on the planet, Thomas J. Ord, has a new book out called Theologians and Philosophers Using Social Media: Tips, Advice, and Testimonials. Now, this is a book of short little chapters from academics all over the place, 91 to be exact, telling different ways they use online stuff. So if you're into thinking about what is it like to do theology and philosophy and do it online and connect to the communities, then you should check this out. And here is just a list of some of the people who've been on the podcast that are in this book. Rabbi Brad Artson, Richard Beck, Heidi Campbell, David Congdon, Robert Cornwall, Oliver Crisp, Miguel de la Toya, Bruce Epperly, me, Carl Gilbertson, David Gushy, Christine Helmer, Robin Henderson Espinoza, Larry Hurtado, Grace Ji-Sun Kim, Daniel Kirk, Todd Littleton, Jay McDaniel, James McGrath, Brian McLaren, Richard Ward, Jonathan Russell, Aaron Simmons, Leonard Sweet, Nathaniel Welch. That's right. That is Nathan, who's all sometimes in the intros and all that kind of stuff. Kurt Williams and Amos Young, and many, many more. I'll link to it, or you can just type in Tom Ord, Theologians and Philosophers Using Social Media. It's a great collection, lots of advice, and I'll have to say this, of the 93, mine is not the best. I mean, it's got to be one of the best, I'm sure. In fact, I have no idea. I've been reading it through and keep picking up new ideas and stuff. So if you are into being nerdy and building a platform, connecting with people, it's a great text to check out. And so it's kind of like 90-some recommendations all packed in one. All right, here we go. The one and the only Stephen Knapp. He's clearly relaxed and reflecting. And I do want to say one thing before I jump in here, and I just Trip, you already said that. I know I did, but this time I really mean it, because I forgot to talk to him about his time as a leader in the sanctuary movement back in the day, like the first time we had the sanctuary movement, when we were dealing with the government becoming a much more hard line and aggressive at deportations and such. He was integral in the sanctuary movement first time, and is working with the National Cathedral and things, addressing it today. I just completely forgot to talk to him about it, because he and I have talked about it before, and I was enjoying talking to him about all the other stuff I hadn't heard. So, and then we get done, and I'm like, I didn't even ask him a question so we could talk about being an OG member of the sanctuary movement. So, my bad. Now, here's the conversation. A look at the life of Steve Knapp. Enjoy. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Trip, and on the podcast is Stephen Knapp, and he is in his final year as president of George Washington University. He is a longtime friend and collaborator with Philip Clayton. He is a scholar of literature, Romanticism, literary theory, and he's been on the podcast on a number of different ways before, but this is the first time he's here solo for an entire interview. So we're going to get to hear the story, intellectual journey, story of faith and career of a man who's cross disciplines and served in different types of roles in the academy and in the church. So thank you, Dr. Knapp, for being here.
Well, thanks very much, Trip. I should make one correction, if you don't mind.
Oh, yeah.
That is that I'm actually not any longer in my final year. My final year of the 10 I served as president of George Washington ended on August 1st. So I'm actually now on a sabbatical. I'm on a year-long sabbatical. I'm involved in a number of projects. And the plan is to return to the campus next fall as a university professor and to teach. So that's where I am at the moment.
Oh, sweet. Well, so why don't we begin where, tell us about your place growing up. Like, when was it that you realized, that you had a vocation in, the academy and education?
Well, it was a very circuitous route, as it is, I suppose, for many people. I grew up in suburban New Jersey, not far from the George Washington Bridge, into New York City. I actually, for most of my time in middle school, which was then called junior high school. And high school, I thought I was going to be a professional musician. I was a drummer. That was sort of my life. I used to actually take a bus into New York to take drum lessons down near Times Square at a time when it was very different from what Times Square is like now. It was all strip joints and bars and things. And it was a pretty interesting experience going there as a 14, 15-year-old and wandering around Times Square in order to take drum lessons with a musician who was active on Broadway and in studio work there. And in fact, when I was a senior in high school and started applying, thinking about going to college, I managed to get into Indiana University, which had a very strong percussion department in its music school. And that's what I thought I was going to do. And then I think I had one too many conversations with a professional musician that persuaded me that if I was going to go into music, that was all I was going to think about for the rest of my life. And I had some broader interest in that, which I kind of discovered in the course of that year. So instead, I ended up applying to a liberal arts institution that did have a lot of music activities. And then when I got there, I almost flunked out of my freshman year because I spent so much time playing music outside of the classroom. But I was kind of rescued by a very complicated event. This was in my freshman year, was 1969-70. And the spring of 1970, there was a trial of Bobby Seale, who was head of the Black Panthers in New Haven, Connecticut. And as a result of that trial, there was a huge protest that gathered in New Haven, Connecticut, and shut down the university for several days. And as a result, the university decided to let everybody. This was near the end of the semester. It was actually just before May Day, in fact, and it was just before the Kent State shootings. And the combination of the Kent State and the results of that is, I think most of your listeners be aware that students were shot at Kent State in Ohio, protesting the bombing of Cambodia by Richard Nixon at the time. And that, together with the protests around the Black Panther trial, closed down the university long enough that the administration decided to let everybody who wanted to take incompletes and finish their work over the summer. So I did that, and that kind of rescued my freshman grades. And so I ended up graduating on time in 1973. By that time, I had gone through studying Russian and, again, doing a lot of music, but I ended up actually majoring in English. Then I took a year off doing sort of different kinds of jobs, working at a bookstore for a while in California. My family had moved out during my senior year, had moved out to California from New Jersey to the San Francisco Bay Area, and I worked in a bookstore for a while. Finally decided to go back to graduate school, went to Cornell University. I'd been an undergraduate at Yale. I went to Cornell University in the fall of 1974 after a year doing other things, and did a PhD in English there. So my first teaching job was at the University of California at Berkeley. I spent 16 years there. And at that point, we really wanted to move back east for a variety of reasons. My wife was from upstate New York, my wife Diane. She missed the seasonal change, actually quite a bit more than I did. I sort of liked the subtle season and lack of humidity in the Bay Area. I could have probably stayed there forever. But she wanted to come back, and we had family reasons as well. So I was, thinking about making that move, and out of the blue, I was invited to become the Dean of Arts and Sciences at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, and spent 13 years there, first as a dean, then as provost, and in 2007 was asked to come down to Washington, D.C. to be the president of George Washington University. So that in a nutshell is the kind of trajectory. Of course, there was a lot else happening there, and I know you're going to want to talk about because I haven't said anything about what any of this has to do with my interest in religion, theology, and so on.
Well, maybe you can take us back to those the moments into the 60s, beginning of the 70s. You talked about the trial of Bobby Seale, the Kent State shootings and things. How did going through that time of kind of political tumult and change and cultural shifting and stuff impact and shape your own kind of spiritual life?
It's sort of interesting because I don't think so. I probably have to back up a little before that. I was raised in a Presbyterian church near my very small hometown in New Jersey, in suburban New Jersey. And but my family sort of lost interest in that while I was still a teenager. I actually remained interested a little longer than they did. I went through the communicants class, and so that would have been age 13 or so. And then eventually I dropped out as well, stopped going to church because I couldn't drive myself there, and they stopped going. So I just sort of drifted away from it. And in the late 60s, there was so much excitement about what was happening culturally and politically. I played rock and roll, I played jazz, I played in symphonies and so on. So I had this very active life in musical performance. I was also interested in a lot of philosophical issues, had a lot of late night philosophical discussions with, other students and that sort of thing, which was pretty common in those days for people. I'm sure they still do have, late night conversations about, their views of the world and so on. But I would say that all the space that you would think of today as filling a spiritual life was pretty much moving in other directions at that time. And I think very few of the people I knew had any particular religious connection or would have regarded themselves particularly spiritual. They would have regarded themselves engaged in a lot of interesting things. They would have regarded themselves as politically engaged. They would have seen themselves as culturally innovative, but they probably wouldn't have described themselves as particularly spiritual unless the minority of them who were continuing to go to church, most of them in my recollection at the time seemed to have been brought up in Roman Catholic households. I had a roommate, for example, who was still, I would say, a pretty devout Catholic, but that struck the rest of us as kind of to one side of what we were interested in. We sort of shrugged about it. It was something we didn't really pay much attention to. And it wasn't really until I got into graduate school, which was a little bit less frenetic in its lifestyle, because, as a graduate student, you spend a lot more time by yourself in the library. I wasn't engaged in musical activities at that point. And I was really focused on the study I was doing of English Romanticism, which meant a lot of time reading, for example, German philosophers of the period. Mm-hmm. It was then that I sort of began very very gradually to regain an interest in the things that had moved me when I was an early teenager, when I was probably was the height of my earlier interest in Christian theology and Christian thought and the possibility of religious engagement. I got married at the end of my time in graduate school. That was in 1978, and we did. My wife Diane had also been raised in a Presbyterian church. We got married in her hometown, which was not too far from Ithaca, where Cornell is located. And we did choose a church wedding. I actually wrote a poem for the occasion, which was, I would say, had a religious sort of tenor to it. But at that point, if you had asked me what my sort of philosophical leanings were, it probably would have been something like a Unitarian. I certainly wouldn't have regarded myself as a convinced Christian by any means. And then when I moved to California and started teaching, it was a very different set of interests that kind of emerged there, and I could talk about those as well.
Well, so when this kind of reawakening towards the transcendent or the questions that of ultimacy and things come by engaging in understanding of philosophy and literature and the Romantics, so can you describe for us kind of what that awakening felt like? What were the initial feelings and such? Because one of the things I've found just in talking with people listening to the podcast is there are quite a few people that listen who would they're nerds who have an experience like that, maybe in literature, or are struck with awe in studying science and this kind of thing. And the podcast is like how they find out they're nerdy Christians and maybe can connect with the religious tradition again. But as a preacher's kid who's really enjoyed his faith and enjoyed asking questions, I don't have an existential experience of coming to it again anew in some completely, like backing back into it through questions and a quest.
Yeah, I know it's a really good question, and it's a very hard one to answer because, it's sort of hard to know what's going on in one's mind, one's soul, whatever it is that's occurring when you go through one of these transitions. And you can you have to be a little skeptical about your own reconstruction when you look back. Am I making things, seem a lot neater and cleaner than they actually were? My sense is there were sort of two things happening simultaneously that were only somewhat related. That on the one hand, I was, because of the work I was doing, I was exposed to a lot of sort of theological talk and sort of conceptualizing, because one of the figures I worked on was Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and he had started out mm-hmm. as a sort of Unitarian, with a Unitarian philosophy that gradually became more a Trinitarian over time, and he did that. He was helped in that process by his reading of German philosophy, much of which he plagiarized. He was a notorious plagiarizer, very complicated figure, and became sort of famous as a promoter of sort of deep philosophical thinking in a country, England at the time, that wasn't particularly hospitable to it. And he had a huge impact on the rest of the 19th century in England because of that role that he played. So that gave me a kind of an intellectual window to theological thinking. I actually started reading theologians just to get a sense of the context of what he was doing. So that was part of the intellectual work. At the same time, though, this was actually not so much while I was still in graduate school. I made the mistake that many people make, which I would really hardly recommend against, which is I didn't finish my dissertation by the time I left graduate school, so I still had to work on it when I was assistant professor. So here I am preparing my course. It was a little bit desperate in some ways because I'm trying to develop a full teaching program at the same time that I'm still working on my dissertation. And that kind of intensified the whole process, which probably helped focus my attention on those issues. But at the same time, and I think almost independently of that, I began to have kind of a desire that was growing in me to become connected with the church community again. I just felt a loss of that, or sort of a need for that, frankly. And I think that was more psychological and emotional and spiritual than it was really driven by intellectual interest. So the intellectual interest kind of cleared the ground in a way to open the possibility of resuming a connection. When I first started going back to church, I was sort of presented as kind of doing a favor to my wife, who had an interest in doing this, and we went to a Presbyterian church. And there, it was helpful to have a very powerful preacher, a minister, a guy named Bob McKenzie, who still, I think, preaches at least on occasion in the Bay Area. There was a church called St. John's Presbyterian Church in Berkeley, California, and he was. I remember him. In particular, an Advent sermon focused on Bonhoeffer's, has that extraordinary analogy where Advent is like a prison door. It can only be opened from the outside. It's a very powerful moment in Bonhoeffer's writings in prison. And that's particularly struck me and sort of got my attention and sort of opened some possibilities to me that had really been closed for quite a few years. And But there was actually a conversion moment, I have to say, and that was when I was it was a little bit bizarre because I was reading particularly dense passage in the opening of The Sickness Unto Death by Kierkegaard, and I can't imagine very many people have been religiously affected by reading those extraordinarily abstract pages from Kierkegaard, some of the most abstract writings that he ever produced. And it was in the course of doing that a lot of these things were kind of roiling around, I think, in my head. And all of a sudden I just had this kind of intense realization moment of just coming to experience the truth of what I would call the truth of the gospel. Mm-hmm. And it just really, I was sort of flooded by a sense of that. And, that struck me there. It was a very powerful experience. It kind of subsided as these things do, and then sort of came back gradually. And, over a period of some weeks, it sort of brought me into this sense of conviction that has wavered back and forth ever since, but probably never completely disappeared since then.
Mm-hmm. So when you have an experience like that, and then or also someone who takes the intellectual critical thinking quest seriously, how have you come to see the relationship between that kind of existential register of faith and the intellectual quest of skepticism and critical reflection?
Well, there I have to say that a huge role has been played by my now, 30 years of correspondence with someone I met when I was on a sabbatical, spending time as a scholar in residence at Williams College in Massachusetts. And my next door neighbor, I happened to run into at a lecture or something. We were standing around chatting, and turned out we both had an interest in sort of German theology. And he had actually studied with Wolfhart Pannenberg, one of the theologians I had been reading, which was an amazing thing. I mean, Williams is a very small college in a very small town, and to have somebody living next door to you who's got that interest was pretty startling. His name was Phil Clayton, and I think somebody I know you know well, Trip. Now I think now he goes by Philip, but then he was Phil. And we started talking and started a correspondence. I was there for just about 8 months. But when I left, we continued our correspondence. I think in those days, it wasn't even email. It was actually letters that we typed and mailed back and forth. I think I got my first personal computer the following fall. So we weren't even online or anything. But we've since then, we've actually exchanged thousands of letters. And then when he moved from Williams College to Sonoma State College in Santa Rosa, which was his hometown, we were living pretty close to each other because I was teaching at Berkeley, living in Oakland, California. He was at Santa Rosa, and we saw each other occasionally. So we had face-to-face conversations as well as our correspondence, and we began to work on exactly these issues. What's the relation between rational inquiry and science and contemporary worldviews and so on, and the deliverances of the Christian tradition. And I'd say we sort of more or less systematically started raising those questions. And over those decades, we occasionally wrote together, particularly on science and religion for a center at Berkeley called the Center for Theology and Natural Science, CTNS, which I think still exists at the Graduate Theological Union there. I'm not absolutely positive whether it does, but we were involved with it. And then eventually in 2011, we published our book, The Predicament of Belief. And that title was pretty carefully and explicitly chosen to address exactly what you're talking about. And The Predicament of Belief, the full title of the book was The Predicament of Belief, Science, Philosophy, Faith. And it was taking all the reasons for doubt that to us, at least the most powerful reasons for doubting the claims of a traditional religion that are raised by science and philosophy and so on, and then kind of really teasing them out and trying to understand how to reconcile them or how to square them with one's kind of abiding attraction to the claims of a traditional faith. In our case, we think it could be applied to other religious traditions, but in our case, of course, it's Christian claims that we were interested in exploring in the light of these reasons for doubt. And we've actually continued that project. It didn't end with the publication of that book. We still maintain a very active correspondence, and a lot of the questions that we think we've settled, crop up in new ways. But I think we did arrive at a position that we were pretty, I wouldn't say happy with, but we felt kind of worked. I mean, a kind of equilibrium that I guess the best way to describe it would be to point people to that book.
Mm-hmm. And if you're new to the podcast, you can always just type in Predicament of Belief, and you'll hear an episode where you and Phil talk about it when we did the book party for its release, and I'm sure there's other times it's come up. One of the questions I think that would be helpful is, can you describe, as someone who spent a lot of their academic career in literature and literary criticism and coming up in the American academic scene, the same time kind of postmodern deconstruction is really emerging in literature departments and things. What were those criticisms, those challenges to faith that came out of your disciplines you're bringing into this correspondence? Just like Phil gets hung up on science stuff in unique and particular ways. Like, what were those, the questions and insistences that you kept pointing back to and insisting to wrestle with?
Well, I think one way to describe, you could perhaps generalize about it by using the phrase that, I'm trying to remember who coined it. It might have been Paul Ricoeur, but there's the phrase is the hermeneutic of suspicion. Mm-hmm. And what that has to do with is just a convergence of a lot of different approaches in literary criticism. It's also, to some extent, you can find it in philosophical criticism, but particularly in literary criticism and some versions of historical work that occur. And it's a convergence of, I think, Freudian psychoanalysis and the implication that religious beliefs are, sort of motivated by various psychological pathologies, or structures that come out of early childhood that get played out later in life. And what everyone thinks of those, they were very that was a very common approach to literature when I was sort of coming up through that into that discipline. And but also Marxian critiques of religion as ideology that masks and facilitates oppressive social relations and economic relations. Feminist critiques of patriarchal hierarchies, very much were coming to the forefront when I was studying literature. By the way, I've taught all these things because one of the things I frequently taught, both to undergraduates and graduates, was the history of literary criticism, the history of literary theory. I've written a lot about literary theory from a lot of different perspectives. So I sort of became an expert in these movements, and I would teach them at various levels at Berkeley over a number of years. So I was kind of very much an insider when it came to understanding how these critiques were structured. I remember at one point I was involved in bringing Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, feminist critic of the New Testament, to Berkeley for an event sponsored by the Pacific Coast Theological Society. And I actually ended up using her work in some of my own work. I remember Norman Gottwald, biblical scholar, who wrote this kind of encyclopedic account of the Hebrew Bible, focused very much from a Marxian perspective. And so I had a lot of ammunition there that had developed over quite a few years from many different scholars that I had spent a lot of time working on. And so it's all those sources of suspicion that religion is a kind of mask or instrument of oppression were probably the aspect of doubt or the source of doubt that came from my discipline, in addition to, as you were saying, the obvious skeptical resources of science, particularly when it comes to things like the theory of evolution, cosmology to some extent, but to a much greater extent, I would say probably the greatest threat to traditional religious belief has been evolutionary thought, and to which one could add, because it doesn't come directly from science, but it's related to that, the problem of evil, particularly natural evil.
Mm-hmm. So what has been, how would you describe the kind of postmodern deconstructive impact on the American Academy and the way it has, positively and negatively shaped the discourse around theological reflection?
Well, so one of the things that's happened in the American Academy as a result of all these strands kind of coming together, strands of suspicion coming together, has been a general assault on what might be called the canon. So the canon is an interesting word because we think of the canon as the set of books that were selected by the church early in its history to become the Bible as we know it. We know that was a complicated, kind of fraught process in which things were accepted or rejected from the Bible. That had happened earlier during the formation of the Hebrew Bible. There had been a similar kind of process, but there was a very explicit sort of counselor action that took place early in Christian history to say these books are going to be in, these books are going to be out. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that's happened in biblical criticism during, starting well before my lifetime, but really intensified during my lifetime, has been increasing skepticism about that process, and a sense that was not a disinterested process, that the so-called Gnostic Gospels, right, which were discovered in the 20th century, were deliberately excluded for ideological reasons, that if they had been included in the Bible, we'd have a very different text from what we have now and a totally different theology from what we've inherited. So that's one kind of attack on the canon. In the case of literature, it's taken the form of questioning whether classical literary works, the ones that have, that used to be taught in the classrooms and so on, were selected in a disinterested way because of their aesthetic value or their philosophical depth or whatever it might be, as opposed to being selected because they represented the interests of a particular class or sex or whatever it might be. And so skepticism about the canon, both the literary canon and the religious canon, I think those converged in a way that has had a tremendous amount of influence. And it means that if you look at the structure of, say, an English major curriculum today and compare it to what it was when I started out, my first course in English was a Greek books course in which you read the classics of Western literature. It was followed by a course in which you read the classics of English literature. And if those courses exist today, which I sort of doubt, they would have a very different structure and they would include a completely different set of texts probably from what they did when I was taking them. It wouldn't be all male authors. It wouldn't be all, the books that had been read by generations of, elites in Western culture. And in fact, the structure of the major probably wouldn't have the same set of requirements that it had back then. So it had a huge pedagogical curricular impact on university education and probably high school education. Mm-hmm. And that's parallel to what's happened, I think, in religion, where there's been a kind of scattering of, a sense of what really counts as religiously authoritative. And you see that in the struggles, particularly the mainline church right now, to hold on to members, but also to have a sense of its abiding identity. All those assaults, I think, have kind of converged. And you can attribute some of that to the kind of deconstructive criticism that you're talking about. But of course, it has roots that go much further back than that. In the case of the Bible, into the German higher criticism that developed as early as the 18th century.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, out of that comes like in one sense, it's a positive thing to begin to include more voices and texts and experiences in the tradition and widening it and stuff. And there's also difficulties, at least in religious studies, when I've taught undergrads, their lack of familiarity with all the texts the people they're reading are referencing, right? Like Derrida was more well read than people that like Derrida, and
right.
And so I just remember in teaching theology in seminaries, oftentimes your students who have finished their year-long classes on New Testament Hebrew Bible, that they're more familiar with deflationary accounts of historical criticism of the text than the actual narrative of Scripture and the stories and the history of their interpretation and stuff. So you then are in the class where you don't always cross your fingers when saying God, and it's a seminary trying to talk about this long conversation the church has had about theology. And so I wonder how you, when you're thinking as someone who spent years as a president of a university, like how is it you see these historic conversations and traditions of the West and the church and these type of things, and the underside of those monologues? Like, how do you see the shaping of education and formation kind of benefiting from both conversations?
Well, there's no question that the opening up of things has been really important, and there's no question that now it's possible to get for people to pay attention to works that used to be regarded as marginal, either because they were written by women or because they were written they were written in English but in other cultures. So this developing interest in world literature, the fact that English no longer means works from England or North America, but has a much broader range. There's no question that those are all positive, but the flip side of it is exactly what you say, which is that look, when I started out in the English department in the University of California at Berkeley, when it came time to consider the promotion of a faculty member, from say assistant to associate professor, associate professor to full professor, everybody in the department was able to talk about the work of that person because they all had in common the experience of having read essentially the same things, and even if they weren't experts in that particular field, they knew enough about it that they could form an opinion on it. Today, English departments are much more like math departments or microbiology departments, where the only people who are qualified to talk about someone's work are people in that particularly very small niche. So the specialization is another expression of this sort of dissolution of the canon, the fact that the canon no longer has the authority that it had. And the simple practical result of that is people haven't read those books. You can't assume that somebody who's come out of an English PhD department has read any particular literary work in the past, and that would not have been the case, a generation ago or 2 generations ago. What it I think suggests is there's a crisis in the humanities, which is pretty exactly parallel to the crisis in particularly the mainline church, once again, which used to be the dominant religious institution in this country. There was a time when the major Protestant denominations were the center of religion in this country. Now, of course, they're increasingly marginalized. We know the demographics from Pew and others that have done the research on this. We know that the nuns have grown. The NONES have grown much more rapidly, or even more rapidly than the mainline has declined. And I think these phenomena are related to each other. Of course, in the case of religion, they're exacerbated by the kind of consumer culture that we have, and the shrinking of attention spans. The fact that it really is hard for people. It's even hard for me these days to sit, through an hour-long ceremony of any kind, because one is used to doing things in much shorter intervals, and you can attribute that to the internet. You can attribute that to the kind of consumerism that is now the center of our economy and so on. There are lots of factors that kind of converge. But I do think this dissolution of the canon has a lot to do with what's happened both in the churches and in the humanities. And when I say the humanities, it's not just English departments, also history departments. What counts as an historical question that's worth studying used to be pretty clearly defined, for better or worse. It did mean that a lot of human experience was neglected by historians. People didn't pay attention to it. They thought it was trivial or marginal. And now the sense that there are the big events of history that you need to focus on, that has dissolved as well. So that there's almost as if there's a canon of events, just as there's a canon of books that used to have authority in intellectual circles and no longer does. So it's good and bad. It makes life complicated, and it really, exactly as you say, it really makes things tough pedagogically, because it's so hard to know where to start, and it's so hard to know what's in bounds and what's out of bounds, and it's extremely hard to predict what your students will or will not know when they come into the classroom. So I think it's made teaching in the humanities much harder than it used to be, and probably much less satisfying for those involved in it than it was, just because there's so much uncertainty and instability in that practice. And I, as a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, I participated in a commission on the humanities a few years ago that looked at a lot of these problems and tried to come up with some solutions. But I have to say it was floundering quite a bit, because nobody really knows how to deal with this new world in which we find ourselves. Mm-hmm.
So as someone who's spent a lot of time in higher education and working at universities and seeing undergrad, like, how would you describe the shift of kind of spiritual religious life on campus over your career?
Well, that's more complicated even than what we've just been talking about, and it varies quite a bit from institution by institution. Mm-hmm. So at my particular university has a very large Jewish community. Many of the members of that community, I would say, are quite active in their synagogues, in Hillel, which is, the organization at many universities that promotes Jewish life and experience on campus. We have at George Washington a very active Hillel community there. They have 3 services on a Friday: an Orthodox, Conservative, and Reformed service. At least they did at one point there, because I've attended some of those. And we also have probably the largest active Christian community is Catholic. So there's a Newman Center there on campus. Again, this is something that you'd find on many different college campuses. And I would say that one of the most moving things that I experienced every year, just before commencement, on the eve of commencement, Saturday before our big ceremony, we would have our commencement ceremony right on the National Mall between the Washington Monument and the Capitol. It's kind of an amazing thing. 25,000 people be gathered there, and we'd have 5,000 graduating students, undergraduate and graduates. It's a pretty big institution. But the day before that, we had an interfaith baccalaureate service in which students from 5 or 6 different religious traditions would get up and talk about what their faith had meant to them in the course of their undergraduate experience. Very moving occasions. There'd be music involved. I spoke, 10 years in a row at that event about some of the things we've been talking about. And so, I would say for some students, there's a very deep and a rather profound engagement with their religious traditions. And it often plays out in forms of community service. So mm-hmm. one of the things that didn't exist when I was in college was organized opportunities for students to go out in the community and, paint schools, provide tutoring for elementary and high school students around the city. We have student volunteers that are active in every part of Washington, D.C., which is a very complex city with huge disparities of economics and health and everything else. And our students are really engaged in that. And many of the students who are engaged in that are religiously motivated. So you could say, I think it's certainly the case that there's much less embarrassment about religion in today's university than there was when I was a student, in which, as I say, it would only have been a minority of students who were maybe active, Catholics from their childhood, who would even, ever go to church when I was in college. It's just not something that was on our. It's not something we paid any attention to, and we didn't have the kind of community volunteer activity in college. Students might be politically involved in demonstrating and that sort of thing, but they weren't out there in any kind of organized way doing tutoring in the schools and that sort of thing, or at least those are fairly modest programs at that time compared to what they are today. So I would say the paradox is that today's students are, if anything, more engaged than they were, and many of them more religiously engaged than they were, despite all the dissolution that we were just talking about of religious traditions. Well, so how you square that, I'm not totally clear, but that has been my experience.
Well, I've had two students who I was their youth minister both graduate from George Washington, and they both had kind of continued growth in their faith and spiritual journeys, like while they were there, and mentioned the baccalaureate services. And one of them said she had been there and it was almost Christmas break, and it had gone to two Christian things and they were very too conservative. But she met a Reformed Jew at a Greenpeace gathering, and so she started going to the synagogue because they said it was okay that a Gentile came. And so, and so she's like, at home, she's like, it's really cool. I still do a lot of the Bible stories and pray and they do activism. And I was like, oh no, that's cool. So even thinking about that story compared to a Southerner at a Baptist school in the South just 20 years before in college, there is a definite, shift. And I wonder if part of it is, as belief in God became isn't normative anymore. It's something that someone you can imagine having or not having. Then the differences that used to distinguish people of faith are both simultaneously more valued in that you enjoy the uniqueness of your tradition, but they aren't divisive differences. So you see it easier to see as allies, people that are sharing something you share deeply across those religious differences.
Yeah. It's funny. If you want to put it negatively, you might say that's a natural expression of a consumer culture in which everything is a matter of choice, right? I mean, you can take something or leave it. Some people want to go rock climbing, other people want to go to rock concerts. And some people want to, spend their Fridays at a Jewish service. Others want to do something completely different, and it's all okay because those are your choices to make. And so that can look like a kind of trivialization or a kind of shallowness. And I think often this current generation of students is interpreted that way as just not having any real commitment to anything. And you hear all these criticisms of millennials for not being really, committed to any kind of long-term engagement in anything, and just feeling like they can, they kind of pick up and move in a different direction whenever they want. And there's no doubt some truth to that. That's kind of the negative side of it. I would say the positive side of it is exactly what you were describing, which is that precisely because there isn't this expectation that everybody's going to be doing the same thing, students are free to find their, the cliche is find their passions and follow their passions. I found that to be true. I found the students to be extraordinarily engaged and passionate and creative, not bothered by the kinds of distinctions that would have divided us. One example of that is that, I find students will come to me sometimes and talk about how they have a plan to launch a nonprofit, corporation to solve some problem in Haiti or something like that. And they've already worked out all the details. They've lined people up to help them do it. But at the same time, they've got a for-profit angle that doesn't even bother them. Whereas in my day, you would have thought of nonprofit and for-profit as being sort of the bright side and the dark side of things, right? And they don't have that kind of sense of that things are fraught in the same way they would have been in my generation. So I think there's been some liberation and it's enabled students to be very creative in their engagements and to really accomplish a lot that and they're probably more effective at what they do than members of my generation were for that reason. So it's hard to know what kind of valuation to give it, but it does make it complicated to be an institution that's trying to get, a few hundred people to sit still for an hour at a church service. Mm-hmm. And that's what's being experienced. I'm on the chapter of the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., and we talk about these issues all the time because we're watching what's happening to the Episcopal Church. For example, I can talk about that story, but I've been spending more time in Episcopal circles in recent years than Presbyterian. But we're watching this kind of dissolving of the church and the shrinking of parishes all over the country. And yet at the same time, when I work with young people, I find, the kinds of passionate engagement that we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm. So what's been your experience or insights over time on campus to a lot of the criticisms that, or challenges that are coming up and, that are often directed towards millennials that, they need such a safe space. And then they argue about free speech on campus. And then, they're also graduating with more, student loan debt and less opportunities. They end up back at their parents and this type of thing. When you've gotten to know them and see them, but also, share the generation's experience that tends to critique them, what has been your kind of response to your peers, about the students and the predicament and challenges they face?
Well, we're probably a little bit unusual. George Washington's probably a little bit unusual because so many students come to Washington, D.C. because they're interested in debate and discussion, and they're interested in policy, things like that. I mean, even no matter what they might be majoring in engineering, they might be majoring in dance, but they still have the reason they're in Washington rather than somewhere else is because they want to be part of what's going on, in the world of policy and politics and so on. So paradoxically, we keep getting ranked as the most politically engaged campus. And people think that means that our students are out in the streets demonstrating, but what it actually means is they're involved in political campaigns, and they want to be part of that rough and tumble of political life. And so we didn't experience that. We haven't experienced the shutting down of speakers and things like that have happened on other campuses. Our students want to engage and want to be involved in debate. We have young Republicans and young Democrats who share the same office, for example. So we're a little bit unusual in that way. So that gives me somewhat different perspective than might be the case elsewhere. I sort of understand both sides of that issue of the free speech issue because, I do have a sense that, that the free speech question has gotten politicized. It's being turned into an instrument in the cultural wars, that are being waged very deliberately, I think, by certain interest groups in this country who really want to see people divided, culturally and politically, because driving a wedge in that way, has some benefits for getting some of the things accomplished they want to get accomplished. So I think there's a lot of strategic work that's gone on behind the scenes in organizing this attack on campuses for being intolerant of free speech. And I think a lot of that work's being done by people who don't have any genuine interest in free speech, to be perfectly honest with you. At the same time, I'm not comfortable seeing a speaker from the ACLU shouted down on the William and Mary campus because she defended the right of a white supremacist to speak or something. So it's a complicated issue, and university presidents, I no longer have to deal with this particular aspect since I'm out of that job at the moment, but university presidents have got a very difficult tightrope that they're trying to walk in making sure that they are preserving a space for open dialogue and debate, and making sure that free speech remains a reality on university campuses, but at the same time trying to resist the ways in which that issue has been exploited by groups that really don't have the best interests of the students in mind.
Mm-hmm. When you hear people giving kind of a Monday morning quarterbacking advice to the higher education system? Like, what are the things that people say that we should do to fix things, be it like, like student debt or opportunities or training for jobs or the role of higher education and citizen making and this type of thing? What are the things that you go, if you just knew, you wouldn't say that? Or here's some ideas or solutions that if Steve Knapp had the magic wand for the day, he would do.
Well, I mean, a good example of the problem you're talking about is when people look at the so-called cost of higher education, and they look at the sticker price, and they think, they say, well, college costs so much nowadays, nobody can possibly afford it. And what nobody wants to talk about or realize is that there's a very clear reason for that, which is that we have a system in which the students who pay the full price, which is a minority of students in most cases, it's maybe in our case probably a third of all students who pay the actual cost of the full tuition, are subsidizing the students who can't afford that. So we have, you can call it pejoratively the Robin Hood system. It's the high price, high aid is the other way it gets talked about. And what it means is because we no longer as a nation are regarding education as a public good, we're regarding instead as a private, benefit that you can enjoy if you can afford it. What's happened is you've seen massive defunding of education by the government, both federally, but particularly at the state level. And the result of that is that the only way you can pay for the institution is by having tuition, which is rising much more rapidly in state institutions than it is in a private institution like ours. And, we've seen these double-digit increases in tuition. And the reason that's happening is they need the money from families that can afford it to support the families who can't afford it. Mm-hmm. So most students at my institution, most institutions are actually on some form of financial aid. Very few students pay the full price. And that's only made possible by having some students who do pay the full price. And if you don't like that system, the question is, well, how are you going to pay for it? And the notion, what I do think is the notion that it's because somehow, universities are profit-making institutions is just nuts. We don't make any profits. We spend everything we make every year pretty much, and we spend it on, the instruction of students by paying faculty salaries. Essentially, that's the main cost of most of these institutions. And who's going to pay faculty to teach students if there's no money to do that? And where's the money going to come from? If it's not coming publicly, because education is regarded as a public good that's good for the nation, it's good for the state, good for for all of us. If it's not going to come from there, it's going to come from people who can afford to pay it. And that's going to mean that there will be these high prices that some will pay, but most will not. Now, debt is the other solution has been borrowing, and that's again it's a result of deliberate government policy. A lot of these state houses have decided that it's better to get people to borrow money to support their own education than to tax people to pay for it, and so there's been a shifting of the burden from the taxpayer to the individual families. That has taken place over decades now, and it's been a very deliberate policy shift. So when people say, well, why is student debt what it is? It's because it's been deliberately engineered that way to replace an earlier model of funding in which I think when I started teaching at the University of California, something like 60% of the budget was paid for by the state of California. Now it's something like 6% or 10%.
Yeah, and then
so where's the rest of it come from? The rest of it comes from students borrowing money to pay for their education.
And state schools in California, through I think the late 70s, early 80s, if you graduated from a public high school with good grades and you got in, you didn't pay tuition, and you paid fees, but they were very small. Yeah, like the number of people at the church I worked at who graduated with no debt from UCLA, compared to their grandkids who, if they get in, are going to graduate with a lot is high, and I wonder, to me, one of the things as a who's had a lot of students go on into college, that's always been a concern for me is the vocational narrowness when they leave college with a lot of debt. Because we know that good higher education, they're going to discover new passions, new insights. They'll see the world deeply. They'll be becoming independent of their parents in unique ways. And they may not even know their best gifts, vocation, and what they want to do in the world. And then they could be passionate about starting this nonprofit or being a public school teacher in an area that's not financially rewarding to do so, or something like that. And then their student loan debt narrows what they can do vocationally.
No, that's exactly right. And in fact, that's one of the main reasons why I put so much effort as university president of raising money for scholarships. And I would often talk about exactly this, that if you want students to have the freedom to choose the kinds of professions they're going to go into, and that's going to benefit society because it will mean going into professions like, public school teaching and so on. We've got to do something about this debt burden because otherwise they're not going to be able to do it because they're going to have to find jobs that pay enough to pay back their college loans. And that's not serving anybody's interest. It's not helping them achieve their aspirations, and it's not helping society to benefit from, what we've invested in their education. So we've got to make it possible for them to graduate without debt, precisely so that they can have the kind of freedom that that we hope they can enjoy. So I completely agree with you. But again, the real solution, and I don't know if it's politically possible these days, is to have a recognition that there is a public benefit to this, that we want to have. I mean, we keep hearing all these complaints about how, we can't get people to go into or stay in the ranks of public school teaching, particularly those who have expertise in the sciences or whatever it may be. And how do we address that crisis? Well, we're not making it possible for people to do that because we've had these policy decisions that have been made by legislatures across the country to basically defund the schools and require the students to pay for their own education out of their future earnings. And as long as that policy exists, we can't really address that problem. There's only so much you can do by raising funds, philanthropic funds to pay for scholarships.
So if someone listening is considering more education or a parent getting ready for their kids to think about it, what kind of advice would you give them or questions for them to ask their young students about the economics of education, vocation, and this type of thing?
Well, look, it's still the case, despite everything we've been saying about cost and debt and all the rest of that, it's still the case that you're better off getting an education, a college education, than you are if you just look at just from pure personal, selfish interests. Mm-hmm. All the studies will show that you're still going to be better off over the long run, even if you have a debt burden that you graduate with than if you don't. So I would say, get as much education as you can. In most parts of the world, people spend much more on their education than they do on their housing. One of the crazy things about our society is people spend so much more on things like housing than they do on education. You can actually compare these statistics, and when people talk about, different societies and what their priorities are, our priority has not been placed on education the way other societies have, and I think that creates a problem both for the individuals and for the society as a whole. So, what I would say to parents is that your daughters and sons will succeed, are much more likely to succeed if they do what really moves them and what really drives their interests. They will do better not only in their college work, but after college if they pursue their interests. They can always, pivot, do something else afterwards. But this notion that you want to find a short-term specialization that will, result in a high-paying first job, I think is very short-sighted. And I think, again, there's plenty of evidence that people who start out in something like the Peace Corps making almost no money — I don't even know what the Peace Corps pays these days, if anything — often will succeed later in life because of that experience and what it's meant to them and the doors it's opened for them than, if they had just gone into a highly paid profession as a computer programmer or something, the day after they graduated. Doesn't mean there's anything wrong with computer programming if that's what people want to do, but I would not encourage a family to say, well, let's find the job that's most likely to be open tomorrow and, put pressure on our daughter or son to major in that because it's going to pay off in the short run. Mm-hmm. Because education really needs to be seen as a long-term investment. We're not very good at long-term investments in our society, as everyone constantly points out. And that's a really good example of it. Because, being open to new experiences, following your interests is going to take you much further in the long run.
So you're involved in a number of institutions, be it in the church, in the academy, you're in DC, which is political institutions and things. What's the best case for institutions when you're talking? What happens when institutions are attended to and run well?
Well, first of all, I think they have to have a pretty clear sense of what their mission is and what their distinctive strengths are, and what the opportunities are given their location, given their history, given the array of talents that they brought together. And I think there's way too much of partly it's driven by things like U.S. News and World Report and the crazy ranking system. That's a whole other subject. Spend another hour talking about that. But that is a driver of conformity, and makes everybody look to do the same thing as everybody else, and it overlooks the distinctive advantages and distinctive attractions of different institutions. One of the other things I say to families is, look, keep an open mind about the kind of institution that you might want to choose, because we have one of the real strengths of the American higher education system is the extraordinary range of different kinds of institutions that we have, from small colleges in rural settings to large research, state research universities, to private research universities like ours, in cities, out of cities, all across the country. And different students are going to thrive in different settings. And I think paying attention to the diversity of institutions is really important. And when I approach any institution, and certainly this is true when I got to Johns Hopkins, which is a totally different kind of institution from Berkeley, totally different kind of institution from George Washington. When I went to George Washington, my approach whenever I've come to a new place is figure out what it is about that place that really matters and can really make a difference in the lives of students and in the lives of the community around it. And I do think it's important that institutions be engaged in the communities that surround them. That's one of the things I spent a great deal of time and effort on, both at Hopkins and at George Washington, was connecting the university to the community around it. And I talked about all the things we were doing in Washington. I could go in a lot more detail about that, but I think that's another, not just a responsibility of institutions, but it's something institutions have to do for their own benefit, because they are part of the communities in which they find themselves. And if those communities don't thrive, the institutions won't thrive either.
Mm-hmm. Well, in one of the things that I think is striking is that that's also really good advice for a religious institution as well. Like knowing your mission, what are your resources, who are the people that are a part of you, your location, how do you connect and committed to the community, and that type of thing. And one of the things that has that happens in course in different places, but in the academy is, the moment of decision between, like staying a research professor and then going in or going into, leadership roles in different places. And having been, not just a professor, but a leader in the academy for this long, like what have been some of the insights or observations you've made about what leadership in general looks like and what good leaders do?
Well, so I think one of the things in an academic institution, the big shift that you have to make if you're going from the faculty to administration is moving from, being a faculty member, pursuing a particular research specialization is a very, I don't want to say selfish, but it's a very precise and specifically focused on your work. That's what you need to do. If you're going to really succeed as a scholar in any specialized field, you've got to have a really intense interest in the contribution that you're making through your work, whatever field you're in. As an administrator, you're only going to succeed, and probably only should be doing it if you're interested in helping other people succeed in their projects, and if that's actually more important to you than succeeding in your own personal projects that you've chosen. And that's not something that everyone can. That's not a shift that everyone can make. And in my experience, and I by the way, the reason I ended up deciding even to do the deanship was by the time that was offered to me, I had already spent enough time in various kinds of committees and things that I'd gotten interested in a wide range of disciplines. So I had an interest in the sciences. I had an interest in other humanities fields besides my own. And in a way, I gradually shifted from an interest in what I was going to be writing about to supporting the work of my colleagues. And so it's very much an outward-looking rather than inward-looking kind of focus that you have to have as an administrator. And the administrators that I think are successful, or at least are beneficial to their institutions, are the ones who can make that transition. There's no question that there's a loss there, that you're something you're giving up, because, there is something to be said for being the person in the world who knows more about X than anyone else, and therefore can make a unique contribution to the creation of knowledge. And there's a kind of excitement and a kind of satisfaction that goes with that. And when you move into administration, you're kind of giving that up, because you're not the one making the contribution. You're the one helping others make the contribution.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first thing. And then there are all the obvious things that people say about leadership, where you have to be open to criticism. You have to be willing to listen to a variety of viewpoints. You have to be flexible, but you have to be able to make decisions when the time comes to make decisions. And combining all those factors together is pretty rare for somebody to be able to do all those things equally well. I certainly wouldn't make any claims about myself in any of those regards. The one thing I do know is that I did have a broad interest and continue to have a broad interest in ensuring the success of those around me.
Mm-hmm. So, maybe the last question is one I'd be interested in too. Like, if someone's listening, they've been and they're a theology nerd and stuff, but they haven't spent much time reading the Romantics, those books that first kind of sparked engaged the transcendent. Like, what's one of the texts you fell in love with early in your career you continue to return to?
Well, I guess, for someone who's got an interest in theology and wants to know about the Romantics, I would probably say start with what the Romantics started with, and which are still probably the richest sources for theological imagination, at least in the English and American traditions, and those are the works of Milton and Shakespeare. And particularly, I mean, I was actually hired at Berkeley as a Miltonist. There was somebody to teach Paradise Lost and related works, and I do think Paradise Lost, even though it's a little bit tough to get into, if you really do get into it, I think it's still an amazingly rich resource for religious imagination going down through the. If you really want to understand where a lot of American thought about religion came from, it's when people traveled across the frontier. Europeans, that is, obviously coming across to North America, they typically had with them three books. It was the Bible, it was the works of Shakespeare, and it was Milton's Paradise Lost. And I'd say, I like to go back to the beginning of things, and that's where I would kind of start. Mm-hmm. And those were the influential works. So I would say there. And then, of course, if they have an interest in poetry, I'd certainly recommend in particular the works of William Wordsworth. And you could start with his Prelude, which was his autobiographical poem that was not published till the very end of his life, till after his death, actually. Or you could start with the if you really want to just get a raw experience of the attraction of the English Romantics, it's that 1798 book Lyrical Ballads, which was a joint book of poems by Wordsworth and Coleridge. It has the Rime of the Ancient Mariner in it, and it has a lot of Wordsworth's early poems. So mm-hmm. Those are a couple of places to start.
Awesome.
A few places. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk and answering questions and sharing about your career.
Trip, it's always a pleasure. Thank you.